Good morning, doctor.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing fine. How you doing?
Doing great. Thank you so much for having me on. Really super appreciate it.
Well, congratulations on the book. As you know, I read it. I loved it. I blurbed it. I think
Thank
it's
you.
a really important book to get out there.
Thank you.
When we were in medical school, it seemed like we got a pretty good explanation as to what happens in the brain of someone with Parkinson disease. When I read your book, it was interesting because it's not a disease that I treat, as a neurosurgeon myself specifically, but it really upended, I think, a lot of things in terms of how I thought about the disease. The idea that we think of it as solely a brain disease. And I think for a long time, it seems like there have been other paths towards how people may potentially develop this disease. I think in terms of why it occurs, there seems to be a genetic component among Ashkenazi Jews, for example. But for the vast majority of people, that does not seem to be the case. It's not their genetics as much as it is their environment. These are big ideas, Doc, in terms of actually thinking about this disease. So I'm curious, you're a doctor, you went through medical school, you're studying this disease. What made you initially decide to dig a little deeper?
Yeah, well, it turns out that there's a lot of myths out there about Parkinson's, and people think about Parkinson as just a disease of dopamine, for example.
Right.
And I think that it's really important that we look beyond, the surface, that we scratch and we go deeper. And for me, remember, I have the real advantage of having a laboratory, studying these brain circuits. But what's the best part about my job is going in and meeting with families, seeing people from every continent except for Antarctica, understanding, what's going on. And it becomes obvious, just absolutely obvious when you see the folks with disease, that this isn't just a disease of dopamine. It isn't just a disease of the brain. There's multiple brain circuits, but it's way beyond the brain and way beyond dopamine. We see it in the gut. We see it in the skin. We see it in multiple organs. And so it is super important that as we move forward, that we ask the why. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is learning why. And why does it start? Why does it progress? Why does it spread? And we really have to get past, what we learned in medical school. It's not just a disease of dopamine. It's not just the brain. That's a myth.
Are people adequately treated, though? Leaving aside the etiology or the sort of causes of the disease, how would you sort of gauge the state of treatment or options for patients?
Yeah, so I'm really concerned about where we are with treatment. We have this miracle pill. It doesn't cure the disease. That's dopamine replacement or levodopa, but the majority of the globe doesn't have access to it.
Just leaving aside the rest of the world for a second, right now, if someone were diagnosed with Parkinson, let's say here in the United States, where you are in Florida or I am in Georgia, what can they reasonably expect? How hopeful or optimistic should they be that they could live a normal lifespan with Parkinson disease?
Yeah, the idea that those 4 words, Sanjay, that you hear, you have Parkinson disease, when you hear those words, they're going to be absolutely emblazoned, imprinted on your brain that moment. It's like the moments that in history that happened, you know exactly where you were, you know exactly what happened on those days. We have to teach people that when we give that diagnosis, you have Parkinson disease, that it still should be a hopeful and happy moment and not a moment of a death sentence. It should be a life sentence because there are so many things that we can do now for this disease. And we know that folks will mistake it for ALS or Lou Gehrig's or Alzheimer's or brain tumors. And we have so many good treatments that we really do want people to erase that myth from their brain that, you have Parkinson's, it's like all these other things, just go ahead and pack your bags, you're done. It's not true. We actually have folks who have the diagnosis with Parkinson's disease who actually say they feel better. They have a better plan. They're doing better. They've never been healthier since getting the diagnosis. It was a wake-up call for them. And that card of getting Parkinson, we need to teach people that there are so many things we can do, behavioral, medications, surgeries, and then there's so much hope that's on the horizon.
And we're definitely going to talk about that today, because I think what you write about with regard to things as basic as exercise, to obviously the medications that you just mentioned, and even in some cases, operations in the form of deep brain stimulation, there are options for people. And we'll reinforce this, because I think a lot of people are going to be tuning in today who are worried about themselves or a loved one. And I think that hope, which I saw infused throughout your book, I thought was really important. One of the things you talk about early on, and you use this word, Parkinson's disease epidemic. You know, can I call you Michael, by the way?
Yeah, absolutely.
Call me Sanjay,
Michael's fine.
please.
Yeah.
Michael.
Yeah.
You know, again, as a doc, you know, a lot of times when I hear about the prevalence or even the incidence of things increasing, you look at what is happening with society overall. So, for example, if a population is aging, we have older people in the population, a greater percentage, then you see more age-related diseases. That's not surprising. So when I first heard about some of the numbers regarding Parkinson's disease, I sort of attributed it to that. But you quickly sort of say in the book, not so fast. And one of the reasons you say is that this is not happening at equal rates globally.
Yeah, and when we dig into that, Sanjay, so let's dig into that. So in about 2012, 2013, I'd written this book called Parkinson's Treatment, 10 Secrets to a Happier Life. And in that book, in the prologue, I used these two words, the Parkinson pandemic. And you would have thought, all of my colleagues thought I was leaving the planet, like I had committed some huge sin. And the reason that I use those words is, first of all, the words translate to mean, pan means all, demos means people. So you begin to see, the expansion of a disease. We often use words like pandemic for infectious diseases, but of course, when we started to use the word, we didn't even understand, what infectious diseases were or infectious particles were. And so it's really a growth globally of people that are getting a disease. And there was this drip, Sanjay, for many years of this seems to be this tremendous growth in the numbers of Parkinson's. And we just kept looking the other way. It must be aging, right? It must be that we're all just getting older. But at the same time, remember, we're clinicians. We're at the bedside. We're seeing these young people with Parkinson's, 20, 30, 40, and we're checking their genetics, and they don't have genetic abnormalities in many of these cases. And so it can't just be aging. And then when you look at the numbers don't suggest that it can be represented just by aging alone. So then we write this book called Ending Parkinson's Disease in 2020, and we have this major advantage, Sanjay, and the advantage is Bill and Melinda Gates funded this study called the Global Burden of Disease Study, where they gave us numbers that we could dig into. And so we dug in and we said, oh my gosh, by the year 2035, we're going to have 12 million cases of Parkinson. And then everybody suddenly went, wait a minute, maybe we have a problem with growth here. This growth is really tremendous. And they got really well, maybe there was something to this whole Parkinson pandemic idea. Then we write the book, The Parkinson Plant. And we look at the next cut of global burden of disease numbers from the Gates Foundation. We already have 11.8 million people with Parkinson now. We're growing even faster than the numbers people were alarmed at before. We're now growing as a neurodegenerative disease faster than Alzheimer's disease. That should grab everybody's attention. And so we have to look at the reasons why. We have to understand that only 13% of people have a single gene that is associated with Parkinson. Now, there can be multiple genes that are involved, but 13 out of every 100 have a single gene. So what about environment? What about lifestyle? What about these other things that we really need to be thinking about and digging into? And sometimes as scientists, we end up, kind of down that road where we're looking and we're really, not expanding our perspective and looking at all the data as it's coming in. And so I think it's time for us to reassess where we are.
It's interesting, Michael. I think philosophically, there's always this sort of tension with this idea that certain things are preordained. Either because of genetics or just because of the unlucky draw, whatever it might be, you're going to get it or you're not. It seems like just about every disease, you could sort of start to argue that that's not the case. That if you dig deeply enough, maybe you don't know what it is yet, but there is something else that may be driving those people developing the disease. And I just find that interesting. With heart disease now, I think most people are very comfortable with the idea that there are risk factors that are modifiable. I think people are starting to feel the same way about certain neurodegenerative diseases. Part of the reason I was so fascinated with your book, again, is because I hadn't thought of Parkinson's disease that way. To me, it was this idea that you have this part of the brain, the substantia nigra, which is a part of the brain that seems to become depleted over time of dopamine. And that just made sense. But the idea that there are modifiable things that are driving that's fascinating, humbling in a way, but I think also inspiring in terms of what people can do about it.
Yeah, it's totally humbling and it's totally inspiring, and it should totally light a fire under the things that we can do. And I think for me, and in writing this book, we tried to become storytellers. We tell a lot of history. And one of the quotes in the book is from Hippocrates. And Hippocrates actually talks about disease and about disease having causes. And of course, we need to go to the root causes of disease. But he also talks about disease being really the combination of all of our daily sins, as humans on Earth. And I think it's, you think about, the reflections and about what we know and about what we don't know, it is very humbling. And when we think about, we go down these roads of being preordained, right? So you find one cell in the brain that is really important and is lost and is really easy to see because it's black. And when the black cells go away, the black cells have dopamine in it. Sure, it must all be those black cells with dopamine. And then we scratch a little deeper, we realize not only is it not just a disease of dopamine, not just a disease of the brain, it's a disease of the body. But look at the opportunity, Sanjay, that we have. We have such an opportunity now to understand, hey, we don't have to live in a world where we think it's inevitable to get Parkinson. Why don't we live in the world where we're thinking about cardiology, how we changed heart disease? Why are we not thinking about primary prevention in diseases like Parkinson's disease if it's not all aging? The amount of suffering that folks have to endure with a chronic disease like Parkinson's disease is really tremendous. The caregiver strain on caregivers and families is really high. The stigma that we have, did you know 25 to 50% of people hide the diagnosis of Parkinson? I mean, it's crazy, right? We're all mortal, right? We're not all going to live forever. We want to live as good as we can. But at the same time, why should people have to hide the diagnosis that they have? Though we have developed, some tremendous treatments and made really huge strides, and we can change the lives and help people to have more meaningful lives with Parkinson's disease, it doesn't mean that we've gotten to that core cause. Why does it start? Why does it spread? Why does it progress? And by us studying those things and moving our therapeutics toward understanding the why, looking upstream, not always looking downstream at, these are all the effects that happen. Let's walk up the stream like multiple Nobel laureates have taught us and see what it is that's causing this. And we can wipe out so much suffering globally for this generation and the next. Diseases have causes. We need to get to the root causes. And the best treatment isn't a pill, it's a policy, it's prevention.
And we're going to talk about that because, again, I want people who are listening to get their minds around the idea that something like Parkinson's disease can be prevented. That just think about that. Let that settle in for a second while I ask Michael to really define what is Parkinson's disease then. Let's start with what I think most people sort of think of immediately, the physical symptoms.
Yeah, so when we think about Parkinson's, it actually is one of the most complex diseases in medicine. I remember being at the White House and giving remarks and calling it the most complex disease in medicine because it has so many symptoms. It has what we call motor symptoms, so tremor, stiffness, slowness. But it also has these what are called non-motor symptoms: depression, anxiety, apathy, demoralization. And when you put all that together, add in the fact we have this great pill called dopamine that can treat many of these symptoms, and then we have deep brain stimulation, we have focused ultrasound, we have all of these new therapies that are coming along, as well as behavioral therapies, and they change over time. When we treat someone with Parkinson's, it becomes a very complex disease. The disease, we believe, could start either, we call it brain first or body first Parkinson. That's the leading hypothesis. It doesn't mean every hypothesis about how it starts is correct, but we tell the story of Per Borgheimer, who is in Denmark, who talks about brain first and body first. So brain first would be you get it through the air, you breathe it in, and there are these two train tracks that go straight to your brain, and they're called the olfactory or your smell centers. And so could it come in that way? And then another way is through your gut. So perhaps through bad water, through food, through pesticides and things. So brain first and body first Parkinson. We still don't understand the causes of Parkinson, but we're now seeing this drip, Sanjay, of studies showing us that pesticides and chemicals and other toxins and things that are in our environment are strongly associated with Parkinson disease. And we've ignored it, partially because of the dogma, partially because of the preordained, idea. But when you start to see study after study from multiple places, multiple continents, then you start to say, maybe we should rethink this.
When you say you can breathe it in through your nose or take it in through the water, what is it in this reference?
Yeah, so we're thinking about, so when we think about pollution, air pollution, there are these tiny particles that are smaller than the size of a grain of sand. They're 2.5 micrometers, and you'll see that in all these articles, whether you read the New York Times, the USA Today, you'll say 2.5, is these tiny little things that can be breathed in through your nose. And within those, they can be associated with metals like manganese. They can be associated with other toxins that are in the air. When we think about what's on your food, the pesticides weren't invented, to cause disease. They were invented to get the pests off of the farmers' diseases, help the crops, feed more people, make sure we had less people who were hungry in the world, but at the same time, we don't wash those pesticides off of our foods. And so the pesticides like paraquat that are on food, and then water, the water that we take in, trichloroethylene, and in fact, water contaminated through the dry cleaning industry, by military bases. And we have to begin to think about air, water, and food as being primarily areas where we think about how these toxins can get into our body. And by the way, as a clinician, as somebody that sees a lot of folks with Parkinson, I'm absolutely embarrassed and really feel like 20 years ago when people came into my practice and said, hey, I have Parkinson, and my neighbor across the street has Parkinson, 3 doors down, somebody else has Parkinson, the street over. Seems like there's a lot of Parkinson in my neighborhood. And we would all say, including me, oh, that's probably just a coincidence, right? And now we have data on golf courses. We have data on environmental toxins. We were not looking at clusters. And it really is something that we all should be humbled by and begin to learn. And now we are starting to focus in on clusters of disease to understand what are potential causes that increase your risk to have Parkinson. And if they're unnecessary, why don't we have the courage to remove them from the environment?
By the way, and I know you've talked to Michael J. Fox. I spoke to him years ago. Maybe if you can clarify, I think first of all, he developed symptoms very early. And I think he told me he had been working on a movie in Canada when he was quite a bit younger. And then several people who had worked on that movie with him subsequently also went on to develop Parkinson's disease at a pretty young age. Does that sound right? Did he share that with you?
Yes. So it is totally true. He's been public in about this story about his own cluster of Parkinson's disease, and it's very similar to the clusters that we see, and we tell these stories in the book. And so Ray Dorsey and I really become storytellers in this book, The Parkinson Plan, and the storytelling aspect is telling all the stories of these people who have been in clusters and been exposed. And so I think we need to begin to put these stories together. And I think when we tell stories, and we are as part of the human element, and as we think about our lives, we are all the product of all the stories, and we need to share the stories with each other so folks, like common folks, can understand what it is that scientists are starting to latch onto and starting to get concerned. There's an increasing level of concern in the scientific community and in the public about these stories. And the Michael J. Fox story of his cluster of Parkinson's disease is just another drip, drip, drip on top of that faucet.
We often deal in science with something that is referred to as the paradox of ubiquity. And what that basically means is that if there's something that is so ubiquitous in the environment, so common in the environment, that then trying to correlate those things with a particular disease can be really challenging. And so if you're talking about pesticides or certain environmental toxins, a lot of us are exposed to these things. How challenging, Michael, is it to then do the research and be able to drill down and even point at specific potential toxins?
It is so challenging. This ubiquity question is really challenging. And what makes it even more challenging is I'll give you another big word that we use in the book called agnotology.
Right.
Agnotology is, when you purposefully put out ignorance on a topic. And what we have, with pesticides in particular is the same thing that happened in smoking, where we're purposely putting out information that we know, we've even done the research on it, we know isn't true to the public, that propagates this even longer, and it takes it longer, that latent period, the number of years it's going to take us to solve smoking and for people to say, oh, smoking, lung cancer, we don't want to end up in that same issue again because of the ubiquity problem that you talk about. So there is, when we do a study, you're a scientist and you're a doctor as well, and so you've done studies, and you know that when we do a study, the public expects us to tell us what are the risks, what are the benefits, what's the risk-benefit ratio for us to go forward before we bring a new therapy forward and get regulatory approval. When it comes to pesticides and chemicals in our environment, that same standard is not held up. And because of that, then we have this ubiquity question. It's so ubiquitous in the environment. Could it be? Could it not be? Well, when we begin to bring out our science in that scenario, when we have that crutch that we have to carry forward, then we have to use multiple lines of evidence. We've got to key in on what we think may be causing these things, and then we've got to have the courage to take them out of the environment and to measure. And so we can't improve what we don't measure. And so I believe that as we move forward in diseases like Parkinson, we're going to have to not only have the courage to remove these things, but to measure them. And if we're wrong, we're wrong. But we need to move forward. And if we don't, then we risk harming people with things that are unnecessary and potentially preventable.
Before we get to some of the incredibly important practical aspects of the book, just one more philosophical question about this, because I read a few of these pages over and over again. Where are we right now, would you say, from a state of science standpoint, with regard to looking at some of these causes and effects with regard to Parkinson? Is there adequate proof, or are we more in the precautionary principle sort of stage?
So, the precautionary principle, of thinking, we need to take precautions because we're not sure, but we think there's enough evidence to lead us to believe that we could be hurting people. I believe that we're there. Like, we've long passed the precautionary principle. But now what we're seeing is, this huge birth of researchers all over the globe that are adding to the science. And frankly, the idea isn't to try to prove what we want to hear. We don't want to add to that same dogmatic approach, to the preordained approach. We want to know what the science is. And so what is great about having a dialogue, like we're having a dialogue today about difficult and challenging, things that are in our environment that might prevent disease. That's a really important dialogue to have.
Is the United States a bit of an outlier with regard to incidence of Parkinson's disease?
We are. If you look at the maps of the U.S. and particularly farming maps, and we've done a lot of studies on farmers, if you're a farmer, you have a much higher incidence of Parkinson's disease. By the way, I believe farming is the number one profession of people worldwide globally, and that should also make you think about environment and disease as well. And when you think about, the farming industry and in the United States, we still haven't banned paraquat. So when we wrote Ending Parkinson's Disease, we did a White House red card campaign where we flooded the White House with red cards, and we asked for three things, and one of those three things was ban paraquat. It seemed obvious to us. We've more than doubled its use in the last decade and a half. There are other countries like Great Britain who have banned it, but they still ship it to the United States. And many other countries around the world have already banned paraquat and other chemicals associated with Parkinson. And so we're behind. But you know what? I'm optimistic.
In those places where paraquat is not used as much or even banned, do you see a change in the incidence of Parkinson?
Yeah, so super interesting question. And so we now are seeing data come out of the Rotterdam study from the Netherlands, and it looks like we may see some leveling. Okay, so it's early days. And of course, the hardest part about these studies, Sanjay, is we're impatient. Scientists are impatient. Society's impatient. Nobody wants to do the longitudinal hard work and wait. Nobody even wants to fund longitudinal studies, because they're so expensive. We've got to do the hard work on the front end. They're doing it in the Netherlands and they're measuring it. We are seeing some data come out from Great Britain. I saw that really, kind of caught my eye here recently in the last few weeks. They banned back in 2007 and, starting to see what might be some leveling there in Parkinson cases. And so I think that, it's one of these things where, we can deny, we can fight, we can have the dialogue, and all these things are important. But in the end, I wanted to be a history teacher. I know history is going to judge us, and I want history to judge us in the right light, in the way that we looked at the data, we did what we could for this generation and for the next, and we tried to make the decisions that we can that are going to impact as many lives as we can, and we did it proactively, out in front.
Well, I realize I'm jumping around a little bit, but I just want to stay on this for a second. So paraquat, what is it? What are the alternatives to it? I mean, will we miss it? For example, you want a ban on paraquat in the United States. What do we give up for that?
Yeah, so it turns out that paraquat is this pesticide. Side means killer in Latin. And when people came up with these chemicals in the 1800s, a lot of these chemists, they weren't thinking, oh gosh, we're going to kill people, or cause disease with these chemicals. That wasn't the reason they came up with them. They came up with them to try to improve our crops, to feed people. And so the intent was good. And I want people to remember that. The intent of a pesticide is good. And pesticides can be very good things, okay? And when you think about paraquat goes very quickly to the brain and to the lungs, and it goes to a part of the cells that are called the mitochondria. And these are kind of the energy, kind of the pumping iron parts of your brain cells. And it hits an area we call complex 1. Okay. And that's super important for Parkinson, for dopamine, and for some of these other circuits in Parkinson. And Parkinson's cells, the cells we need that cause Parkinson, those are hungry cells. Dopamine are hungry cells. And so when we choose pesticides like that, and we have a story in the book about rotenone, another common pesticide you might find in your garage, okay, herbicide. Tim Greenemeyer, who is a great Parkinson doctor, is one of my mentors when he was at Emory. And Tim ends up studying this, showing it's associated with Parkinson, creating animal models, getting Parkinson himself, and talks very publicly in a story in Science about how he thinks he didn't protect himself as well from the exposures to rotenone. So there are actually, thousands of different directions that we can go in killing pests. And so insecticide, kill the insects. Fungicide, kill the fungi. Side means killer. So we have the ability also to understand what it is about these pesticides, herbicides, and chemicals that are actually causing disease now, because now we can sequence things, we can look at things more carefully. And so there are lots of ways that we can cleverly come up with solutions. And in fact, let me just say, cancers are a huge issue when we think about, what's in our environment. And so degenerative diseases and cancers are so high on the list of things that cause loss of good life for Americans and people all around the world. Why not try to design these things and choose things that are going to be safer? So we just have to have the courage to move the field and to design things and to use the data that we have to try to design plants and medicines and pesticides that are going to be safer for people to take.
If I'm not a farmer and somebody who's not, working at a dry cleaner or, being exposed to chemicals on a regular basis, how worried should I be?
So, it turns out that you should be pretty worried. We all are exposed to things regularly every day. And so we have what's called a Parkinson 25 in the book, 25 things you can do. A couple of the things that you can do, proactively is make sure you have a water filter, a carbon water filter, especially if you can't afford or your county won't test your water. Carbon water filter is so important to prevention of disease. Second, if you live in an urban area or your air quality is poor, make sure that you have an air purifier in your home and in your office. Really easy way to clean out those particles that you're going to be, breathing in. Remember, the nose is the gateway to the brain. And then when it comes to thinking about pesticides, just remember that most of the rules call for 10 or 15 seconds of washing at most before you see a fruit or a vegetable in your home. Make sure you're washing copiously or using a vegetable wash or one of these washes you can get from a number of different outlets. But at least wash your vegetables and your fruit copiously. And remember that when things come off of farms, that the pesticides are on there to help that crop to grow, but they're trying to kill the pests that are on it. You don't want to put that into your body. And so you should be worried. And we talk about, air, water, and food. Ray and I talk about that as a simple way. We go out, we talk to a lot of folks out there, in the community for decades and in different support groups in different areas, and just helping people to have simple, practical solutions. And I think people are starting to get worried about these things as they learn more. And they want to learn more, which is a good sign.
Yeah, I think that there's a pretty significant level of concern about these pesticides overall. I think that what is so good about the book is you sort of lay it out. I mean, I don't think you don't overstate things, but I think this idea that there may be these associations between these chemicals and Parkinson's disease, I think, for a lot of people, it's the first time they're going to be hearing that, having believed this was just sort of a preordained thing. I had a relative who had it. It's not that surprising that I'm getting it. But for the vast majority, more than 80% of people, this does not appear to be genetic, which I thought was really interesting. Mm-hmm. Let's go back to just what is it again, for example. Parkinson's disease, you say there is a brain first and a body first sort of pathway here. What is the sequence of symptoms different for brain first versus body first? What would people notice?
Yeah, so it is actually pretty interesting. And a number of years ago, there was this famous pathologist, Helio Brock, and he talked about this idea that Parkinson's starts in the gut, and everybody went nuts, like, oh, again, you're pushing against, the preordained or the dogma. How could a brain disease start in the gut and work its way up? And he was a pathologist, and so there's been a whole lot of exchange with experts. And what was really nice is that dialogue led to this idea that, okay, well, wait a minute, it turns out that one of the first symptoms of Parkinson can be constipation. Okay. And another early symptom of Parkinson, even before tremor, stiffness, and slowness, they call those the prodromal symptoms or the early symptoms. constipation being one, acting out your dreams being another. So again, those are the sleep areas of the brain. And if you're going up from the gut, those are actually below. If you're going, kind of from bottom to top, those are below where those dopamine cells are, right? And then smell being the third early one, right? So people have talked about also, could there be differences in the symptoms between body first and brain first, whether or not you get a tremor, whether or not, 20% of people don't have tremors with Parkinson's disease, which is actually pretty interesting. 1 in 5 causes a lot of folks to not be diagnosed, because you think, oh, I don't have a tremor. I must not have Parkinson, but 20% of people don't have a tremor. The symptoms of this syndrome, and we should probably call it Parkinson's diseases and not just Parkinson's disease. We're probably not looking at one disease, but we're looking at a group of symptoms that together, and when they respond to dopamine, we call them Parkinson's. And so it may be, and it is hypothesized, and a lot of great scientists, and we talked to Per Borgheimer in Denmark and in Copenhagen, and a lot of those folks there do believe the symptom profiles are different depending on how you acquire the Parkinson. It's early days, but it is something to think about. It's also absolutely fascinating to think about, symptoms like smell loss, constipation, and acting out your dreams happening way before you get any issues or challenges with tremor, stiffness, or slowness. That's fascinating.
Do you run out of ramp room, if you will, with regard to treatment with dopamine? I remember, again, this is not my area of expertise, but I remember being in the clinic, and at some point people would sort of, I'm not sure if the right word is become tolerant to dopamine, but the effectiveness seemed to run out after a while.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you brought this up, because there's quite a number of myths that are out there on this, and I run this helpline for the Parkinson Foundation, this 1-800-4PD-INFO line that's free for folks that can call in and bring their questions up, and it turns out this is one of the most common questions. And we now know it's a myth that dopamine is not toxic. In fact, we have data now from Africa, from Italy. There's a new multi-center data from Europe. So people should not avoid taking dopamine because they think they're going to get a gold medal or something long-term. They're going to get some long-term benefit by avoiding it because it's somehow toxic. It's actually going to help them, and they'll lose a window if they don't. And we've seen that the difference is how long you have Parkinson, not whether or not you take dopamine. When we see these symptoms emerge as a consequence of the disease progressing over time. So the window of when dopamine works may get smaller. Okay, we may have to change the way that we're giving medications. We may have to add, a surgery like deep brain stimulation on board. We may have to change our treatment approach. But things like walking, talking, and thinking, okay, those things are going to progress regardless of our treatments right now. But dopamine itself, for folks that are listening, people should not be fearful of it. And in fact, we see tragedies where people avoid it because they hear these stories, but they should understand these are more disease progression related, and that they shouldn't deny themselves the benefits of dopamine when they can have them throughout the course of their disease.
Look, the audience is learning so much. I'm learning a ton here, and this is an area that I'm fascinated by. Can you definitively diagnose Parkinson?
So, that is a big fat maybe. It turns out that, the best diagnosis of Parkinson traditionally has always been the examination by a neurologist or a healthcare, it doesn't have to be a neurologist, but a caring healthcare provider that's going to follow you long term, make sure you're responding to dopamine and seeing that you don't morph or change over time into something that look like Parkinson, because even some of the Parkinson lookalikes can respond to dopamine. This has been one of the hardest and most challenging things in Parkinson, and most humbling, is when you look at even autopsy studies. That's when people are done with their brains. We never take their brain, Sanjay, unless they say they're done with them. But when you're done with your brain, if you turn it in, we can use it. And we take a look at that. And it turns out that specialists and generalists can miss 1 out of 5 times in that diagnosis. That's a lot, right? And so for those of us that think we're experts in everything, we should, be eating some humble pie and just sort of taking a step back and realizing we're not as good as we thought we were. When we look at the new biomarkers, they're really fantastic. So there's one called synuclein. It's one of the proteins that's in the plaques that get all over our brain with Parkinson. And it turns out, though, that some people don't have synuclein and can have Parkinson's disease in their blood and with certain genes like the LRRK2 gene. So that's not 100%. And then we look at the skin biopsies, those aren't 100%. The dopamine transporters, not 100%. So I think what we're going to see, Sanjay, and even the MRI studies, is we're going to see that we're going to get better and better by combining the technologies together and increasing, in science, we call it sensitivity and specificity. You want those numbers as high as you can to say, okay, now I'm sure you have a diagnosis of Parkinson. But it's still humbling. And I still say one of the single best things is seeing a good, caring healthcare provider, somebody with experience in Parkinson or training in Parkinson would be great, although there's a paucity of the number of people that are trained. We only train about 40 a year, which is crazy.
Really?
Okay?
I didn't realize it was that
40
low.
a year. And those are the people that can help to follow you over time and to be sure you're responding to dopamine and that you have Parkinson and you're getting adequate care.
Look, I'm not trying to unnecessarily or unfairly worry people who are listening. And I think that was what was so great about the book, because it's called The Parkinson's Plan. There's a plan. I mean, you've changed your life in terms of how you do certain things, I'm sure, in response to what you've learned over the last few decades, reducing your exposures, your exercise, things like that. There is a plan here in terms of what people can do, and the book is really good at that. I mean, so many times I think people are left with this doom and gloom knowledge, and then like, what do I do with that? And I think that's just depressing.
Yeah,
that's not what you're saying here.
Yeah, not at all. In fact, it's optimistic. The book, the plan, each stands for different. The letter stands for something different. The P is prevent. The L is we need to learn why, look upstream, why it starts, why it progresses, why it spreads. The A is the amplification of our voices. We got to move those chess pieces differently in our healthcare system. We need a new model for Parkinson, so we propose a new model, the Parkinson Universe model for care, and bring in the people that we need. And the N is the navigation of treatments, but thinking about historically where we have failed and what sort of dollars we're going to need, and the investment. We only invest 2 or 3 pennies of every dollar on prevention in this country and worldwide. This is not going to move the needle, right, Sanjay, so we have to proportionately reinvest. And so we talk about the investment in those 4 areas, the PLA and N, and then the 0, 10, 100. We need to level the rise of Parkinson, 0% rise by 2035. We need to increase that funding by 10 times, and 100% of people should have dopamine. We get HIV drugs and cocktails to people all over the world. Let's get, pennies on the dollar generic, dopamine to people so they can benefit. So
fantastic.
So I'm optimistic, and I think our research is going in the right directions, and we just need to rethink. And I often say move those chess pieces a little bit differently, and we can be more effective in a shorter period of time. And the more effective we are, then we can impact more lives.
You and your team are the leading voices in this country on Parkinson disease. And I thank you for that. I mean, you've done the deep dives, this is how societies learn and move forward. Obviously, you're doing the clinical work and the laboratory work, but then you take the time to educate the masses, which is so important. And even if people are just left with this idea that they have control, that Parkinson's disease can be preventable, I mean, that alone, I think, is a hugely inspiring message. And I really thank you, Michael, for getting it out there. And also on a personal note, I thank you for being so available to me personally as well. Like I said, I call you with my own questions and send you patients, and I really appreciate it. I really appreciate all you do for people.
Oh, no, I appreciate you and also the voice that you give to disease. And people should know that when doctors we go into medicine, we choose it as a service profession. We're here to serve people, and part of serving people is helping people to understand, these diseases, what they can do and how they can be proactive so they're not scared, so they can be proactive and not reactive. So thank you for all you do in that arena.
Sure. Congratulations on the book, New York Times bestseller. You've had a few books in this. People should buy this Parkinson's Plan for sure. But then I think once you read that book, you're probably going to go back and look at doctors' other books on Parkinson's as well, even if you don't have it. A lot to learn there. So thank you, sir.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.